The fluorescent lights hummed at exactly 60 Hz, a frequency Sarah Chen had learned to ignore 3 years ago, back when the sound made her flinch. Now it was just part of the oxygen she breathed, same as the antiseptic smell coating the back of her throat, same as the weight of the clipboard she carried like a shield. Oak Creek Memorial's ICU at 2 in the morning was a kingdom of machines and silence. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms. The cardiac monitors beeped in staggered intervals, each one a different tempo, creating a symphony only night shift nurses understood. Sarah moved through the corridor in scrubs the color of old hospitals, her badge clipped to her chest, her name written in letters small enough that most doctors never bothered to read it. 3 years. Flawless patient outcomes. 0 medication errors. Chart documentation so meticulous that the medical records department had flagged her files twice, asking if she was actually a registered nurse or a data analyst moonlighting in the ICU. Nobody asked her opinion in morning rounds. She had learned to live in that space, visible but invisible, present but unremarked, the kind of competence that went unnoticed because it never failed. No crises. No disasters. Just patients who lived when they shouldn't have, whose vitals stabilized at 3 in the morning because a night shift nurse noticed the subtle shift in their breathing before the alarms registered it. Room 12 was at the far end of the corridor. Commander James Reeves had arrived 6 hours ago via ambulance from a training accident at the Navy Reserve Center outside Savannah. Shrapnel wounds. Left pneumothorax, chest tube already placed in the emergency department. Morphine drip running steady. Vital stable, for now, though the nursing notes indicated he was having intermittent confusion and combativeness when he surfaced from the medication. Sarah had known his name before she saw his face. The moment his stretcher came through the ICU doors, something in her chest had seized, a sensation she recognized as memory trying to claw its way up from the place she kept it buried. She had stepped back, given space to the receiving nurse, let 3 minutes pass before she approached the room. Muscle memory was dangerous. Muscle memory could break protocol. Muscle memory could get her killed, or worse, recognized. His eyes were open when she entered room 12. Morphine-hazed and distant, the pupils slightly dilated, the gaze unfocused in that particular way of a man who had been given enough opioid to soften reality into something manageable. His left forearm lay on top of the blanket, and the tattoo was there, black block letters, recent enough that the ink still had a faint purple undertone where the needle had gone deepest. Her name. Block letters. Permanent. She stood in the doorway for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was all she could afford. His eye slid past her face without any flicker of recognition, traveling instead to the 4-pump, to the monitor above his head, to nothing at all. The morphine had taken him somewhere safe. Safe was good. Safe meant she could do her job. Commander. Her voice was soft, practiced, the voice of a woman who had learned to make herself smaller. I'm Sarah. I'll be taking care of you tonight. He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. His head rolled on the pillow. The morphine was doing its work, pulling him down into a place where Baghdad didn't exist anymore, where 3 miles of open ground and incoming fire were just abstract concepts that couldn't touch him in this white hospital room in Savannah. She checked the chest tube first, the tubing clear, no signs of bleeding or air leak, the collection chamber tracking appropriately. She ran through his vitals, blood pressure 118/76, heart rate 84, oxygen saturation 96% on 2 liters nasal cannula. The shrapnel had missed the major vessels. Missed the heart. Missed everything except the tissue and muscle and bone it had been designed to destroy. He was lucky. In another universe, in another city, with another nurse, he would have been dead before the ambulance left the parking lot. Sarah charted every detail with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was armor. She noted the time he had been admitted. The exact medications in his 4-line. The position of the chest tube and the appearance of the dressing. She recorded his mental status in clinical terms, patient alert and oriented to person only, combative when aroused, readily returns to sleep. She did not write, I know this man. I have carried him through enemy territory while his blood soaked into my uniform. I have watched him smile at photographs of his family in the ready room before a mission. I have listened to him hum an old Beatles song while we checked weapons the night before deployment. None of that belonged in the chart. Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrived for morning rounds at 06 for 5 hours, which meant he was running late. Surgical precision was important to doctors, but punctuality apparently was not. He moved through the ICU with the kind of confidence that came from money and breeding and the absolute certainty that rooms would part before him like water. His watch was an Omega Seamaster. Sarah glimpsed it when he reached for the first patient's chart, the kind of watch that cost more than her monthly mortgage. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a shine that suggested a professional service handled the maintenance. He glanced at Sarah as she moved from one bedside to another, charting vitals and checking medications. His eyes were the color of shallow water, and they moved across her the way a man might notice a good-for line, with clinical efficiency and immediate disinterest. "Who's your night nurse?" he asked the day shift RN, not bothering to read her badge. "Sarah Chen. Been with us 3 years. Solid performer. Quiet type. Patients like her." He made a note on his roster and moved on. Sarah heard it happen in the break room an hour later, the moment Hargrove truly began his assessment of Oak Creek Memorial. He had pulled all the patient files for the past month and was reviewing them with the peculiar intensity of a man looking for something very specific. He sat at the break room table with his coffee, black, no sugar, and spread the charts across the laminate surface like a dealer working a card game. She had walked in only to grab water, nothing more, just the quick efficiency of someone who needed 60 seconds away from the monitors. The moment she saw the files, she understood. Her hand froze on the water pitcher. The billing codes. The consultation fees. The phantom procedures he was documenting as performed by specialists who had never stepped foot in those patients' rooms. And in the chart margins, in careful handwriting that could belong only to one person, were notes that didn't match the official billing. Notes that said, "No consult requested." Notes that said, "Patient not seen by cardiology." Notes that said, "Orthopedic eval already completed by day shift, recommend discharge planning." Need something. Hargrove's voice had the texture of ice breaking. Sarah set the water pitcher down with careful precision. "Just water, doctor." He watched her for 2 seconds longer than was comfortable. Then he gathered the files back into the folder with deliberate slowness, and she understood he had let her see them. Deliberately. He was marking territory. "Your charting is very thorough, Nurse Chen." He said her name the way someone might say a word they were tasting for the first time, checking its flavor. Almost forensically so. "I document what I observe, doctor." That's the problem with precision. He leaned back in the chair, and his presence in the break room seemed to change the air pressure, the way a shark changes a room just by entering it. It leaves very little room for interpretation. She set the empty pitcher down and turned to leave. "Tell me, how many years have you been here?" 3 years, 4 months. "And before that?" Sarah paused at the doorway. The question had a weight to it that went beyond simple curiosity. It was a test, like the moment when a predator is checking whether something is prey or threat. She could feel the calculation happening on his side of the conversation. "Other positions," she said, keeping her voice level. "Healthcare administration." It was not technically a lie. The Navy had kept very good records of her service, though they had kept those records in a file marked top secret / no phone and made absolutely certain no civilian hospital would ever see them. Healthcare administration. He repeated the phrase like he was filing it away. "That's why the charts are so clean. You understand systems." "I understand patients," Sarah said. "And I understand that accurate documentation keeps people safe." She left before he could respond. Back in room 12, Commander Reeves was sleeping the deep sleep of the heavily medicated. His heart monitor traced steady lines across the screen, a normal sinus rhythm, the kind of rhythm that meant his body was healing, that the shrapnel had missed anything truly vital. She checked the chest tube again, noted the minimal drainage, verified once more that the dressing was clean and dry and exactly where it should be. Her left hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle. Just the door handles. Always just the door handles. It was a tic she had developed somewhere between her discharge and her arrival in Savannah, and it never went away completely, no matter how many years passed. Some part of her nervous system still believed that doors were the place where bad things waited. She gripped the handle anyway. Held it. Let her hand steady itself. Breathed once, very deliberately. When she stepped back into the corridor, Dr. Hargrove was standing at the nursing station, reviewing charts. He had Commander Reeves's file open, and his pen was circling something on the billing page. He circled it twice, very deliberately, the way someone marks something that matters. The intercom crackled above the ceiling speakers, and Sarah moved back to her other patients, back to the work that never stopped, back to the invisible place where she had learned to exist. The intercom crackled above the ceiling speakers, and Sarah moved back to her other patients, back to the work that never stopped, back to the invisible place where she had learned to exist. She had spent 3 years becoming a ghost in these corridors, and ghosts do not draw attention. Ghosts do not leave footprints. Ghosts certainly do not get noticed by department heads with something to hide. But Dr. Hargrove had noticed her anyway. He began his campaign methodically, the way someone plans an operation they intend to win. The first strike came 72 hours later, during the morning rounds when the Gold Star family was at the bedside, Mrs. Patterson gripping her son's hand while her husband stood rigid in the corner, the way military families stand when they're holding themselves together with nothing but habit and duty. Sarah was adjusting the full line when Hargrove entered room 447 with 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras behind a shark. His voice arrived before his body, loud enough to carry down the hallway, loud enough for the family to hear every word with perfect clarity. Nurse Chen. Walk me through Mr. Patterson's 0600 medication administration. Sarah turned from the monitor, her hand steady. Good morning, Dr. Hargrove. Mr. Patterson received his medications at 6 minutes late. He cut her off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. 0612 on the documentation. 6 minutes a veteran suffered because you were, what, getting coffee? Charting from memory. The mother's grip tightened on her son's forearm. The father's jaw clenched. Sarah took one measured breath, the kind taught in combat medicine when your hands need to stay steady while everything around you is coming apart. She felt the tear form before she could stop it, one single drop tracking down her left cheek. She did not blink. She did not turn away. She wiped it with the back of her hand and held Hargrove's gaze with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Mr. Patterson's medications were administered at 0558, she said, her voice dropping into a register she hadn't used in 3 years, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Real-time charting. The documentation reflects the actual administration time. Hargrove's smile hardened. Your word against protocol, Nightingale. He used the nickname like a weapon, something small and cutting and designed to sting. I'll be watching you closer from now on. He walked out. The residents followed. And the room filled with the kind of silence that happens when people realize they've just witnessed something carefully orchestrated, not to help, but to wound. Sarah finished her rounds alone. Mrs. Patterson's eyes never left her face. Sarah did not need to look back to know that the damage had been calculated perfectly. A Gold Star family now doubted the competence of the nurse who had held their son through the night. Hargrove had struck in public, in front of witnesses, in the one place where credibility matters most. He had made her small. He had made her visible only so everyone could watch him diminish her. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room assault came 72 hours later, precisely timed for the shift overlap when the night nurses were finishing and the day nurses were arriving. Sarah sat at the grey formica table with her sandwich, turkey on wheat, the same lunch she'd brought every shift for 3 years, and 4 nurses were there with her, ordinary colleagues in scrubs and tired eyes. Sarah had never given them reason to fear her. She had never competed for their assignments, never gossiped about their mistakes, never done anything except work the hardest cases and ask for nothing in return. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at Sarah and raised one eyebrow in a gesture that said everything without sound. One nurse stood, grabbed her food, left within 10 seconds. Then the second nurse. Then the third. Then the fourth. In 90 seconds, Sarah sat alone with a half-eaten sandwich and the hiss of the refrigerator compressor, a sound like something breathing in the dark. She could taste the antiseptic from her gloved hands underneath the turkey. She ate the sandwich anyway. She did not leave early. She did not cry in the break room. She sat there with her hands steady and her eyes forward, and when the refrigerator cycled off, the silence was so complete you could hear her heartbeat if you were close enough. This happened again the next day. And the next. And the next. By the 6th consecutive day of the break room exodus, 6 shifts of watching colleagues flee the moment she sat down, Sarah had stopped bringing sandwiches. She brought protein bars instead, something she could eat in the locker room standing up, something that didn't require her to sit at a table alone. The other nurses began to avoid the break room entirely during her shifts, choosing to eat at their stations or in their cars. The message was clear. Sarah Chen was contagious. Sarah Chen was something to escape. And Hargrove watched it all with the patience of someone who understands that isolation is a tool sharper than any blade. The final blow came 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning when the unit held their 0700 staff meeting with 18 people present, day shift nurses, night shift nurses, residents, 2 hospitalists, the charge nurse, the educator, and Hargrove standing at the bulletin board near the medication dispensary. Sarah was reviewing labs at the computer when she heard her name. She looked up. Hargrove was pinning a formal write-up to the board with 2 thumbtacks, centering it with deliberate care. Her name was in bold letters. The title read, Insubordination and Care Deficiencies. He stepped back, satisfied with the placement. Senior staff, please review this as a teaching example of what we do not tolerate at Oak Creek Memorial. Standards exist for a reason. The room fell into suffocating silence. 18 faces turned toward the board. 18 faces turned toward Sarah. She stood slowly, moving through the crowd like she was walking through water, and read the write-up completely. It cited the false medication timing from 3 days ago. It cited undefined care deficiencies. It cited insubordination and disrespect toward attending physicians. Everything written. Everything false. Everything now part of her permanent record, visible to every nurse on the unit, every resident, every supervisor who walked past that board. Her hands did not tremble. Her voice did not crack. She turned to face the 18 people watching her and took one measured breath. One tear escaped, wiped away immediately, without apology. She held Hargrove's gaze with the kind of composure that comes from a woman who has stared down worse in Baghdad, who has held her composure while 3 yards of viscera slid between her hands, who understands that the only power left when everything else is taken is the refusal to break. My patients are alive, Sarah said, each word separated by silence. That's what I came here to do. She walked back to the computer. She pulled up the lab results. She did not flinch. Hargrove's jaw tightened, a small muscle flexing once, twice, the visible sign of a man who had expected her to cry, to argue, to crumble. She had done none of those things. She had given him nothing. And that refusal to break was somehow more infuriating than any outburst could have been. The rest of the shift passed in the rhythm of patient care. Vital signs. Medication passes. The careful documentation that had always been Sarah's language. But now, as she reviewed the charts at 0300 hours, running through the medication administration records for Commander Reeves and 3 other long-term veterans, something caught her eye. The billing codes. Wrong. All of them wrong. Incorrect diagnosis modifiers. Phantom consultations from specialists who had never actually seen the patients. The phantom charges were small enough to avoid immediate detection, $200 here, $350 there, but across 56 veteran patients over 2 years, the amount stacked like bodies. Hargrove wasn't just sabotaging her reputation. He was building an empire on the backs of people who had already given everything. Sarah made a note in her personal file, separate from the hospital systems. One of many notes she had been quietly gathering. She had learned in Baghdad that documentation was its own kind of weapon, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was simply record the truth and wait. And that's when the monitor in room 12 began to alarm. At 0200 hours, the monitor in room 12 screamed. Sarah Chen was 2 corridors away, charting a medication administration, when the first alarm pierced through the ICU's careful quiet. She didn't move at first. 14 years of night shifts had taught her the difference between a warning and a crisis. Then came the second alarm. The third. By the fourth, her legs were already moving. Room 12 held Commander James Reeves. The SEAL whose name was tattooed on her left forearm in block letters that no one at Oak Creek Memorial had ever seen. Whose eyes had passed over her face in the emergency department without a flicker of recognition, 3 years of morphine and reconstructive surgery erasing 8 clicks through Baghdad gunfire from his memory. The man she had carried. The man she had saved. She entered the room and saw it in one breath, absent breath sounds on the right side, distended neck veins like rope pulled taut, his chest heaving in a panicked staccato that meant only one thing. Tension pneumothorax. His right lung had collapsed and was now compressing his heart. The monitors told the story in real time, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. 89%. 85%. 82%. His skin was turning grey. Call for the on-call physician, Sarah said to the resident frozen at the bedside, her voice level as a surgeon's hand. Now. And get me the crash cart. She was already moving toward Reeves when Dr. Marcus Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his silk pajamas hastily covered by a white coat, his hair still rumpled from sleep. He stared at the monitors. He stared at the gasping commander. He said nothing. He needs needle decompression, Sarah said. Not a question. Not a request. The voice of someone who had performed the procedure before, who had learned it while mortars fell like angry gods on the streets of Fallujah, who understood that the next 60 seconds would determine whether this man lived or died. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, right side. We need to do this now. Hargrove's jaw tightened. We should wait for imaging. Confirm the diagnosis with a chest X-ray. The thoracic surgeon from Memorial Hospital is 40 minutes out. He can handle the chest tube placement properly. He won't last 40 minutes, Sarah said. The oxygen saturation read 78% now. Reeves's gasping had turned into something more desperate, the sound of a man drowning in air. His blood pressure was crashing. His pupils were dilating. Hargrove pulled his phone from his coat pocket. I'm calling up to the conference level. We have 12 physicians on site for the billing compliance seminar. Let's get a second opinion. What happened next Sarah had seen in war zones and corporate hospitals alike, the moment when fear wears a stethoscope and becomes policy. Within 8 minutes, they came. 12 doctors in various states of wakefulness, filing into room 12 like mourners at a funeral, each one glancing at the monitor, at the gasping patient, at the vitals climbing steadily toward catastrophe. Possible PE, said the first cardiologist. We need a CT angiography before we intervene. Could be an arrhythmia, offered the second. Let's get a 12-lead EKG first. Pneumonia with sepsis, suggested the hospitalist. More evident on the right side of the chest. I'd recommend antibiotics while we rule out other causes. Each of them spoke with the careful certainty of people who had never had to decide between waiting and watching someone die. Each one offered a reason to delay. Each one looked to Hargrove, who nodded at their caution, who validated their hesitation, who made waiting sound like medicine instead of what it was, paralysis dressed in a white coat. Oxygen saturation at 71%. Reeves's movements had slowed. His gasping was quieter now, not because he was better, but because his body was beginning to shut down. Sarah's hands were already moving toward the crash cart before her voice caught up with the decision. She didn't ask. She didn't explain. She simply pulled the 14-gauge angiocath needle from its sterile package, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of someone who had done this in a burnt-out convoy truck while bullets punched through metal and blood painted the sand. Her hands knew the angle. Her hands knew the depth. Her hands knew that hesitation was its own kind of death. "Stop." Hargrove's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of institutional authority. Sarah didn't look at him. She was positioning the needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right side. She was feeling for the landmarks beneath Reeves's skin. She was becoming the person she had been before she became invisible, before the Navy had handed her discharge papers with a different name and told her the mission never happened. "Touch me," she said, her voice so flat it sounded almost conversational, "and he dies." She pushed the needle in. The hiss of released pressure was immediate and unmistakable, the sound of a tire punctured by a nail, the sound of air escaping in a rush that meant the pneumothorax was decompressing, that the pressure was releasing, that the weight on his heart was lifting. Reeves's body jolted. His back arched. His eyes snapped open. The oxygen saturation climbed. 76%. 82%. 88%. 94%. His gasping stopped. His color returned from gray to pink, the flush of blood circulating where moments before there had been only hypoxia and fear. The monitor settled into a steady rhythm, not perfect, but alive. The hiss of released air faded. For 5 seconds, there was only the ambient white noise of the ICU, the ventilator's mechanical breathing, the monitor's steady beep, the fluorescent hum of lights that had witnessed 100 crises and counted this as one more. Then Hargrove's face turned crimson. Not the red of exertion. The red of control slipping. Of power dissolving in front of witnesses. Of a man watching his authority evaporate like morning fog. "You just practice medicine without a license," he said. His voice was shaking. "That is a direct violation of state law." "Security!" 2 guards entered from the hallway. They had been waiting, Sarah realized. He had called them before she even moved. He had been prepared for this moment, for her defiance, for the instant he could weaponize her competence into insubordination. She set down the catheter on the sterile field. She wiped her hands on a towel. She stood perfectly still as they approached, as they removed her badge from her scrub pocket, as they escorted her out of room 12 and down the corridor with their hands hovering near her elbows as if she were dangerous. Not to a patient. Dangerous to Dr. Marcus Hargrove's carefully constructed empire of phantom consultations and inflated billings and 12 doctors who had learned to wait instead of act. She heard Hargrove's voice behind her, "Call the board president. Tell him we have a critical patient safety issue." By the time she reached the parking lot, her phone had already lit up with a suspension notice. But Hargrove wasn't done. She could imagine him in that room, pacing, still trembling, making for phone calls in rapid succession because one wouldn't be enough. First to the hospital board president at 0247 in the morning, dangerous liability, patient endangerment, reckless intervention. Second to the dean of students at her nursing school, always had concerns about her judgment, patterns of insubordination, unstable personality. Third to a state licensing investigator he'd gone to medical school with, urgent review needed, flagrant violation of scope of practice, recommend immediate disciplinary action. Fourth to the hospital attorney, prepare termination paperwork, effective immediately, document everything. Sarah drove home in silence, the Savannah streets empty at 0300, the rain beginning to fall in scattered drops that would grow heavier before dawn. Her son Derek was asleep when she arrived at 0415. She didn't wake him. She didn't make coffee. She didn't call her lawyer or her union representative or anyone else who might have known what to say. Instead she sat in her kitchen staring at the shadow box on the mantel, the one Michael had made before the cancer took him, before she was left with a 17-year-old boy and a secret that had cost her everything. The shadow box held medals that no employer had ever asked about. Ribbons in colors that meant nothing at Oak Creek Memorial. Certifications of service that officially didn't exist. The suspension email arrived at 0620, effective immediately, pending investigation, badge access revoked as of 0700, legal department contact for further information. She pulled the suitcase from the hall closet at 0642, the one she'd bought after Michael died in case she ever needed to disappear completely. She'd never unpacked it. 3 years of invisibility and she had kept her escape route ready, like a soldier keeping an exit strategy in every room. She stood in the hallway with her hand on the handle, listening to Derek sleep in the bedroom down the hall, listening to the rain intensify against the windows, listening to the sound of everything she'd built crumbling behind her while the man who had broken it all slept soundly in his silk pajamas, already planning how to bury what had happened in room 12 before the morning shift began. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Hargrove didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know that the man in room 12 would remember her voice. He didn't know that muscle memory transcends morphine, that the body remembers what the mind forgets, that Commander James Reeves would eventually wake completely and realize that the quiet nurse who had saved him in Baghdad had just saved him again, and that this time, someone had forced her to pay for it. The hiss of escaping air filled room 12 as oxygen saturation climbed back toward normal. Sarah's hands were steady on the catheter, muscle memory overriding everything else. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from having held this exact line between life and death before, in places where there were no protocols, no board meetings, no consequences that mattered except keeping someone breathing. Commander Reeves gasped. His eyes fluttered. For a moment, she thought he might see her. Really see her. But the morphine and shock pulled him back under, and his gaze went distant again. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen at the monitor, watching the numbers stabilize. His jaw clenched. His fists opened and closed. He looked at the needle in Sarah's hand like she'd just pointed a weapon at him. In a way, she had. Step away from the patient, Hargrove said quietly. Sarah didn't move. She was checking the catheter placement, ensuring no kinks. Professional. Clinical. The way a Navy corpsman checks a trauma victim's airway when half a unit is already dead and the other half is counting on her to be right. I said step away. She removed her hands. Step back. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were moving inward. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old marble. His eyes locked onto hers with something that looked like pure predatory focus. He reached for his phone with the precision of someone handling a loaded weapon. His thumb moved across the screen. She heard him say her name to whoever answered on the other end, the hospital board president, woken at 2 in the morning with a crisis that required immediate attention. Your nurse just practiced medicine without a license in my ICU, he said calmly. I need her terminated before shift change. I don't care how. Make it happen. The call ended. He turned to the security guard standing near the door, a man whose name Sarah had never learned, despite 3 years of shift overlaps. His eyes wouldn't meet hers. She needs to surrender her badge and leave the premises within 1 hour, Hargrove said. Escort her to her locker. She takes nothing but her personal belongings. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who knew his network would answer. Sarah thought about the calls he'd already made, to the state licensing board investigator who owed him a favor from medical school, to her nursing school references where seeds of doubt were even now being planted in careful language. She could see it all happening in real time, a machine that had been built to destroy her the moment she threatened his empire of phantom billing and inflated charges. The security guard approached. He was large, uncomfortable, clearly aware that he was about to become part of something he didn't fully understand. Miss Chen, he said softly. I need you to come with me. Sarah nodded. She peeled off her gloves, snapped them like gunshots in the silence, and dropped them in the biohazard container. She didn't look back at Reeves. She didn't acknowledge Hargrove's small, satisfied smile. She simply turned and walked toward the door with the kind of steady composure that comes from already having survived the worst the world had to offer. The walk to the locker room felt like moving through water. Staff averted their eyes as she passed. The night shift nurses she'd worked beside for 3 years suddenly found reasons to look at computers, charts, anything but her face. One nurse, Jennifer, who'd borrowed Sarah's stethoscope more times than she'd returned it, actually turned around at the sound of footsteps, as if she couldn't bear to watch. The locker was small and sparse. Sarah had never decorated it. No photos, no magnets, nothing that would create questions about her life outside these walls. She pulled out the small duffel bag she kept for emergencies, the same bag that had accompanied her through 3 tours and 4 years of invisibility. Her street clothes went in first. Then her personal items. A tube of lip balm. A small notebook. A photo of Michael, taken before the diagnosis, before the slow fade, before the headstone with his name carved in letters that looked too permanent. The badge felt heavier than it should have as she placed it on the counter at the front desk. The security guard had escorted her that far and no further. Protocol, probably. He nodded apologetically as she set it down. The young woman at the desk, in turn, maybe, or someone new Sarah didn't recognize, took it without speaking and placed it in a drawer. Sarah walked to her car at 3:53 a.m. The Savannah heat had broken, and the night air felt cool against her skin. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open, breathing the smell of asphalt and distant rain, and allowed herself exactly one moment where her composure fractured. Her hand shook on the steering wheel. Just for a moment. Then she gripped it tighter, steadied her breathing, and started the engine. She drove to her apartment, packed what remained of her life into 3 suitcases, and waited for dawn. The termination letter arrived at 1,620 hours, printed on hospital letterhead, signed by 6 of the 7 board members. Effective immediately. Recommendation for full nursing license review by the state. Citation of insubordination, care deficiencies, and practicing medicine without a license. She read it once. Folded it precisely in half. Placed it in the bottom of a suitcase where it would stay for months without being opened again. At 1800 hours, Sarah drove to Hillside Cemetery in the western part of the city. Rain had started earlier in the afternoon and now fell in heavy sheets, the kind of rain that hammered against windshields and made people drive slower, more cautiously. But she drove the speed limit, her hand steady at 10 and 2, her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached. Michael's grave was in the back corner under an old oak tree, the kind of tree that had probably been there for a century, watching people come and go. She parked 50 yards away and walked through grass that was slick with mud. Her boots sank slightly with each step. Rain soaked through her jeans at the knees as she knelt in front of the headstone. Michael Chen. Beloved husband and father. 1974 to 2021. For years gone and the rain still fell on his grave like it was the first day, like he'd only just left. She pressed her forehead against the cold marble. Rain streamed down her face, and she couldn't tell if it was tears or weather anymore. They felt the same. I kept my head down like they ordered, she whispered. I stayed invisible like they wanted. I didn't tell anyone about Baghdad, about the operation, about what I did for 3 tours. And I still failed. Her voice cracked then, just barely, just enough that she felt it like a fault line opening. I couldn't even save one more without them destroying me. I carried him 8 clicks through gunfire and he doesn't even know my face. The rain hammered harder. Thunder rolled across the city like distant artillery. She stayed there for 40 minutes, her knees sinking deeper into mud that smelled like earth and stone and endings. At some point her phone buzzed, Derek texting, probably wondering where she was, probably scared. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her voice was all glass and edges right now, and her 17-year-old son didn't deserve to hear what she had become in the last 6 hours. At 1900 hours, Sarah drove to the hospital parking lot one final time. The lights of Oak Creek Memorial glowed against the rain-soaked darkness, and she could see into the windows of the ICU on the 2nd floor. Monitors flickering. Lights on. Life happening without her in it. She'd already made the decision. She would drive north to Jacksonville tonight, find a small apartment, work in a pharmacy or a clinic where nobody knew her name and nobody could find her. She would disappear completely, the way she'd been ordered to disappear after Baghdad, the way she should have done the moment she walked into Oak Creek Memorial 3 years ago. Her suitcases were in the trunk. Her car was pointed north. Her foot was on the brake, ready to shift into drive, ready to leave Savannah in the rearview mirror forever. The engine idled. Rain hammered the windshield. And then headlights appeared fast in the rearview mirror, approaching at speed, coming hard from the direction of the hospital. The headlights stopped directly behind her. A car door slammed. And a figure ran toward her through the rain, a tall teenage boy, 17 years old, clutching something rectangular and dark, yelling words she couldn't hear through the glass. Derek's voice cracked as the rain hammered his shoulders. "Mom! Stop!" The shadow box he held caught what little light spilled from the parking lot, dark wood, glass front, and inside, the kind of metal that only sunshine could have tarnished. Sarah's hand froze on the ignition. She didn't turn around. Didn't unlock the doors. The car sat running, packed with everything that fit, destination anywhere that wasn't Savannah. Derek sprinted the last 10 yards and yanked the passenger door open before she could lock it. Water streamed off his jacket. His hand shook, not from cold, but from something electric underneath his skin. "They need to see these. Mom. They need to see these right now." She wanted to tell him no. She wanted to drive. But she recognized the tone in her son's voice. It was the same tone Michael had used the night he'd told her he'd enlisted. That particular flavor of 17-year-old certainty that comes from understanding something the adults around you are still pretending not to see. Sarah turned off the engine. Derek didn't ask permission. He was already moving toward the hospital entrance, the shadow box tucked under his arm like classified intelligence, like proof that the invisible finally had a name. His jacket was soaked through. His hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't slow down. The emergency room doors sensed motion and slid open. Inside, the board had assembled on the second floor in the hospital's conference room, hospital administration, legal, the board president, the state investigator, and a woman from human resources who'd been practicing her sympathetic expression all afternoon. They'd called an emergency session about the commander's liability case, about the nurse who'd committed what Hargrove had framed as catastrophic negligence, about how to proceed when a patient survived against all probability and the institution had already fired the person who'd made survival possible. Derek walked straight into that room without knocking. The fluorescent lights above the conference table hummed their mechanical song. 8 pairs of eyes turned toward the soaking wet 17-year-old holding a shadow box like it was a weapon. Derek's voice cut through the silence. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen." The board president's mouth opened and closed. The legal counsel straightened papers that didn't need straightening. The state investigator looked up, pen suspended, and something shifted in her expression, not belief yet, but the first crack of it. A trembling nurse practitioner stood and walked to the door. She was holding a folder, and her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone operating on pure protocol and muscle memory. Behind her, another administrator followed, then another, all moving toward a secure courier package that had arrived 20 minutes before the meeting started. The kind of package that came with a signature and a federal seal. The nurse practitioner opened it. Inside was a military personnel file. Not the civilian nursing records they'd been reviewing. Not the documentation Hargrove had carefully curated. The real one. The one that had been sealed and classified and locked in a Pentagon database for 13 years. Her hands trembled as she read aloud. 3 Navy Crosses. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. She paused between each medal like she was reciting something impossible. 2 Purple Hearts. Service record spanning 14 years across 3 continents. Medical certifications that read like a field manual. Field medicine specialist. Tactical combat casualty care instructor. Combat medic trainer level 4. The board president's pen fell to the table. Sarah stood in the doorway, still wearing her civilian clothes, her hair still damp from the parking lot, and she didn't move. Didn't react. Didn't blink. Her jaw clenched once, barely visible, and then released. This was the moment. This was the thing happening without her permission, without her request, without her control. And yet her shoulders didn't shake. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "I didn't tell them because I was ordered not to." The doors to the conference room opened again. Commander James Reeves stood in the frame with his four-pole, the medical tape still visible on his chest where 2 ribs had needed reinforcement after the needle decompression, his left arm moving slowly, deliberately, despite the pain still written across his face. He was dressed in borrowed scrubs. He was supposed to be recovering in the ICU, not walking hospital corridors. He'd asked Sarah's hospital liaison officer which room the board was using, and the officer had told him. That was all it took. His voice was steady. Quiet. The kind of calm that only comes from having already survived everything you were designed to survive. "She carried me 8 clicks through enemy fire in Baghdad. Took 2 rounds in her plate doing it. Both rounds that would have been my spine. I only live because she performed a field thoracotomy with a Leatherman and her fingers." The silence in the room was the kind that echoes. Reeves extended his left arm. Everyone could see it. The letters were bold, professional, military standard. Chen. Not just a name. A reminder. A marker that said this man's life had been saved by specific hands, specific skill, specific decision-making when 12 other doctors had said no. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Hargrove. The doors opened a 3rd time. A 2-star admiral walked through, flanked by 2 agents in federal windbreakers with FBI stenciled across the chest. The admiral was 6'2", with the kind of bearing that made the air pressure change just from proximity. His name was Kowalski. His stars caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a warning. Kowalski's voice filled the room the way voices filled rooms when they'd been trained to project across flight decks and through helicopter rotors. Senior Chief Chen was the lead medical officer on Operation Phantom Cipher, which saved 14 hostages and is still classified above your clearance, doctors. She was discharged under protective order and given a civilian identity for her safety and the safety of intelligence assets still operational in theater. Her presence at Oak Creek Memorial was approved by JSOC Command and monitored accordingly. She was not fired for incompetence. She was fired for saving a life. The board president tried to speak. Nothing came out. Kowalski turned to where Dr. Hargrove should have been standing and found him instead attempting to back toward the exit. The admiral's eyes tracked the movement like he was watching a target designator. "You're terminated effective immediately for insurance fraud. We've been investigating your billing scheme for 6 months and used this incident to document your medical incompetence in front of witnesses. 47 veteran patients. $2.3 million. Phantom consultations. Inflated post-operative charges. Equipment billing for procedures never performed." The 2 FBI agents moved without hurry. They'd done this before. Hargrove's arms came behind his back. The handcuffs clicked with a sound that carried all the way down to the 1st floor. Sarah didn't watch them leave. She was looking at Derek, and Derek was looking back at her with the expression of someone who'd just understood that his mother's secrets were larger than both of them combined. The shadow box hung at his side now, the medals visible through the glass, the proof sitting in his hands like something he'd carried all his life and only now recognized. The perp walk made the evening news. Channel 7 News had a camera in the lobby, not for this, they'd been shooting a routine human interest piece about hospital innovations, but they caught it anyway. Hargrove in handcuffs. Hargrove's face. Hargrove being escorted past the night shift arriving for duty, past families in the waiting room who didn't recognize him, past the nurse's station where Sarah's false written warning still hung on the board like a museum exhibit of institutional failure. For hours later, the board voted unanimously to restore Sarah's employment record, reinstate her license with full back pay, and remove every documentation of the suspension from her personnel file. The hospital's lead counsel filed a report to the state licensing board detailing the conflict of interest that had allowed Hargrove's fraud to continue undetected for 18 months. The state investigator, the one who'd arrived ready to revoke Sarah's license, instead filed a complaint against herself for accepting a bribe that she now understood had been disguised as professional consultation. She recused from all cases and submitted her resignation to take effect at the end of the month. The 12 doctors who'd arrived that night and found reasons to wait instead of act received mandatory ethics retraining. 2 resigned before morning. 1 called Sarah's number at 0300 hours to apologize. She didn't pick up. She didn't need the apology. She needed them to understand why they'd frozen, and that was a conversation they'd have to have with themselves. Sarah stood in the hospital conference room with Derek beside her and her full personnel file open on the table. The medal list was visible to everyone now. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Service Record. Combat Certifications. The whole architecture of what 13 years of invisibility looked like when you finally turned it inside out. Derek reached over and squeezed her hand. Sarah squeezed back. "I'm going to need some jello," she said. And Derek laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from understanding that his mother had just saved him, just saved herself, just saved the entire system by refusing to disappear anymore. That night, sitting in her kitchen with Derek while the shadow box sat open on the table between them, Sarah fielded calls from 3 different military commands asking if she wanted reinstatement. Former patients. Corpsmen she'd trained who thought she was dead. Officers asking what her next assignment would be. She answered none of them. Instead she listened to the rain outside Savannah and held her son's hand and understood something that 13 years of invisibility had taught her: the quietest power is always the kind that doesn't need to explain itself. Subscribe to see what happens when the system finally recognizes what it had all along. Like this video if Sarah's story resonated with you. Comment below, if you'd been in that conference room, would you have had the courage to walk in like Derek did? And let me know, have you ever watched someone nearly destroy a good person before the truth finally emerged?